I'm going to begin with a very broad brush looking at the climate change question. Then I'm going to move on to resource efficiency. I'm going to look at the relationship between policy, finance, and technology. I'm going to say something about the responsibility of ownership, or what I might call ownership with attitude. I'm then going to say something about long-term investment and the difficulties we have in properly structuring long-term investment to achieve environmental outcomes. And then I'll finish up with some performance associated with our fund. Now, the climate change issue is a very large systemic problem for the whole of humanity. It's extremely difficult to get your hands on. It's a long-term problem with consequences which are already manifesting themselves. It doesn't fit easily with the way we govern ourselves or the way we finance all types of investments, from innovation through to infrastructure. We don't have a very well-developed human response to a problem of this nature. We have a very good instinct for fight or flight reactions to risk, but we don't understand very well, and certainly don't manage very coherently, risk which approaches slowly from afar in all directions. We like to find individual points of reference to attribute blame. And we can't do that with climate change because we're all implicated. Occasionally you see in the political debate an attempt to find a place to situate blame. It never really lasts for long because there's always some identification with the problem causer that makes it hard to make them villains. Occasionally it'll fall on the oil companies or on China or on the capitalists. It doesn't sit very well in any of those places when everywhere you look there's complexity. And it's very hard to find solutions to problems which we are all implicated in creating without building very elaborate forms of cooperation. And we struggle with that too. We like to compete one against the other. And we've probably overemphasized, maybe we've made that competition muscle very strong and not so developed our cooperation muscle. Although in a way, this room is an example of an attempt to organize cooperation and share sovereignty. Maybe that should offer some kind of inspiration, I don't know. So there's something about this problem which is extremely hard to fix. It's very hard to make progress solving it too, highly abstract, highly distributed. And we need that, all of us, whether we're investors or just in our ordinary working lives, we need feedback, we need validation, confirmation that we're heading down the right track. And it's just virtually impossible to do that with a problem like climate change. Certainly nobody in this room who has a position of responsibility is going to be able to claim at any stage, and that includes a business called Climate Change Capital, that they have in some way solved the problem. You can't get enough purchase on it. You can make a contribution, and you've got to know that you've made a contribution in circumstances where there may be very little genuine feedback that you've solved a problem. Very difficult for politicians to experience that. They want feedback within a political cycle. Very hard for investors. They want returns in a particular time frame. So all of this tells you that we are going to have to find ways of rewarding our progress, measuring our progress, where there is significant uncertainty that will not be resolved, where the scientific debate will continue to be heavily contested, and so it should be. No area of science is without disagreement. That's how we make scientific progress. We disagree, we challenge, we prove, we test. And so we all crave some space in which we can see how we might solve the problem in measurable bits where we can see progress, make it tangible. And also where that progress can feel like life getting better rather than a punishment for past sins. And that's why, ultimately, this area that we're talking about offers such promise for dealing with climate change. But I think we've learned, and in my case over 20 years of work on the subject, that we can't move society simply by threatening fearful consequences from a systemic problem that everybody's implicated in. It's not happening, it won't happen tomorrow. We are much more aware now than 20 years ago, we have a lot more data, a lot more evidence, but using climate change as the main reason for a significant intervention in our economies to make climate risk dissipate is not going to be enough. This is a big paradox. We cannot use climate change arguments to solve the climate change problem alone. But fortunately, if that's the right word, we have another crisis close at hand, which is very obvious to most people, and it's to do with resources and the conflict over resources. Who has access to resources? Who owns the resources that we need the most to run our economies? Where are they? What's the risk in getting at them? Who's got more now? Who's going to get more in the future? How can I build my economy knowing that with population growth and rapidly emerging economies in the East, they're going to want the resources I've taken for granted for the last 25 years? Resource efficiency is largely a question of energy, but it's manifested very clearly in water and in the use of natural resources, and indeed the competition over scarce, rare resources that we now need desperately to run our communication systems. Look at the conflicts already emerging over rare minerals, rare earth materials for the telecoms and mobile phone industry. First signs, if you like, if you want an emblem to look at for resource competition and conflict, just look at the Chinese, Japanese trade restrictions. Export bans are a really good sign of impending resource conflict, and they're starting to emerge. With food too, with food security. You have a collapsing crop, often climate related, a flood, a drought, an inability to maintain resource efficiency in a particular area of the world, and suddenly governments slap export bans on basic commodities like rice. Now those are signs, very visible signs of resource conflict. So without wishing to look for another problem in order to solve the first one, we've got another problem which helps us concentrate on where to put effort that is more near term, where the risk is better understood. It feels more tangible because it's to do with things that we know we need right now: water, energy, food. And if you draw up the list of things that we can do about climate change and things that we can do about resource efficiency, they overlap really very well. About the only things that fall out are actually quite large-scale, expensive projects associated with carbon capture and storage. Pretty much everything else that you would wish to do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and actively finance through the use of public policy incentives and the like, you would also do to make more efficient use of resources. And you would start with efficiency. And you'll see where I'm going with this when we get to what we've done with property investment in the UK in one relatively small fund, because that experience that we now have matches the general observation that you begin with efficiency, that efficiency gets you the most. It also allows you from the start to think systemically about the two problems and how they interrelate. Almost nothing that we think might work to improve resource efficiency and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is of any use on its own. So just as we have a scale problem, which is very difficult to understand and get your hands on, the solutions that we think we have today, with the technologies that we've developed so far, have never been built to scale. None of the renewable energy technologies have ever been built to scale. They're all marginal. So if you want to decarbonize your economy, and believe me, many, many countries around the world have declared a very clear intention to do exactly that, and we might come back to how that's emerging following the Cancun Agreement, then you cannot pick single technologies, and you have to acknowledge that the technologies that we've got carry an awful lot of risk associated with the scaling up process. But if you begin with efficiency and you think systemically, then you know that you wouldn't anyway just promote more greener power production without at the same time taking demand out of the system. And buildings are right in the middle of that system. They are a very significant proportion, maybe even more than 30% in many countries, certainly in most parts of Europe, depending on how much of the transportation system contributes to greenhouse gases, but 30, 40, maybe more percent of most economies' greenhouse gas emissions are situated in buildings and how they're used. And buildings sit in the middle of the system of power production and reducing energy demand. So if you line up climate change as a systemic problem facing the whole of humanity, in its most extreme form, an existential threat, and you look at resource efficiency as a necessary response, the only rational response to scarcity of resources, increased competition of resources, and conflict over resources, and we have it in our faces every day now, then you realize that the policy, finance, and technology relationship that has to be assembled to deal with both provides, one, enormous investment opportunity. The scale is unprecedented. It shows you exactly where to concentrate your efforts, and they are in resource efficiency brackets energy conversion. You could do the same for water. And they also show you that if you were able to successfully respond to these two issues, you reduce risk in the world generally. Clean technology is actually a peace and security issue. Finding more efficient ways of managing resources reduces political risk. So, conversion. We are still not very good at converting primary energy into usable energy. We've had these resources for quite some time. 200 years, give or take, we've really learned how to make phenomenal use of fossil fuels. Truly world-affecting, changing technologies built on this amazing energy resource. Transformed humanity. And no part of my presentations on climate change ever involve some kind of backhand to the fossil fuel industry of the past. I've got a few critical points to make about leadership in recent years, but those technologies have been transformative. Those resources have been essential for human development. But even so, after all that investment and know-how and huge rewards associated with using those fuels to drive our economies, we still don't convert primary energy into usable energy at all efficiently. There's a big study done by Cambridge University looking at the energy flows in society across the world. Very detailed study. It's being evolved year on year. But the last map that they made of energy flows shows 475 exajoules in and 55 out. 475 in, 55 out. Primary energy in, usable energy out. Unless you change those numbers, we have conflict. We have a problem. We cannot manage human development unless you change those numbers. But if you do, you've participated in a transformation that will create enormous wealth. In the list of energy conversion devices, there are massive opportunities for investment, and right in the middle, buildings, cities and buildings, communities and buildings. Energy conversion, primary to usable, every building is a potential conversion device. But, as we all know, we don't think that way now. So my next 2 points are about ownership and investment. One of the things I'm pretty proud of in our modest business. Our business, we have 1.5 billion under management. Seems a lot when you started with nothing, but isn't very much in the grand scheme of things. But what I wanted to do with Climate Change Capital is present a different type of ownership, an ownership with an attitude, a problem-solving attitude. I was unconvinced by the arguments for not doing what we do on a relatively modest scale. And by bringing in people who are knowledgeable about property, who I knew and liked and I felt I could work with, we've made a very small start down that route. And what we've demonstrated is if you own property with a view that it matters what its performance, what a building's performance is, that it matters because in your head at the whole time you're carrying the bigger picture. Because you've called a business Climate Change Capital for a reason. Because you've developed an idea of creating wealth worth having, which is avowedly idealistic. But you've got a point to prove that that means nothing unless you actually create the wealth. There's a financial return, and your investors are pleased with it. Otherwise, they're not going to give you any more. If you go into ownership of a commercial property, things change very quickly. And they don't cost that much money. And most of the changes are behavioral, not technological, although it helps to have good technology, and we'll come back to that. If you come in and you tell an occupier, this is what I intend to do with the property, are you with me? You want to work with me? You watch the relationship change. You watch how it feels to solve a problem together. Particularly, perhaps, if it's a government building, or the government occupies the building, and they've set themselves targets which they don't implement. And they might even have performance targets associated with their senior management, which they don't deliver. But if an owner came along and said, I can help you meet those targets, because that's what I want to do. That's what I want to do with my ownership. You watch your relationship change. You might find that the government wants you to own some more buildings that they occupy. They might have a divestment program, for example, because they're cash-strapped and they want to sell some assets to raise some money, to pay off a deficit. Who are they going to work with? One that delivers their objectives or one that gets in the way? Don't tell me that's not commercial. Now, it happens that coming from the other direction, there is a change of attitude taking place amongst just the kind of occupiers you'd want to be occupying your building. Ones that if you work with to solve a problem, which is a long-term problem, might make your relationship that bit stickier. It might mean that there's less churn in the building. It might mean that you can negotiate a lease that keeps you bound in for longer and keeps a more stable environment around which you can borrow money at better rates, maybe. But most importantly, you can work out ways to make money together. Together. Interestingly, better together. So when we've installed this equipment, when we know what's going on in the building, because absolutely essential is to know what's going on, you need technology for that, and it's abundant. There are so many, we were talking in the coffee earlier, how many energy management software businesses I've seen in the last few years. Just dozens of them. I can manage this remotely, just give me wireless access and I'll tell you exactly what's going on in every room at every stage of the day. There's phenomenal competition out there for the businesses that can measure performance of buildings. And all they need is a little bit of demand. Prices will come down, the technology will get better. And big players come in, all sorts of innovators. But big players, big aggregators like Cisco, all over this space. This is not trivial. It's huge. But they're all waiting for that little bit extra, and we're going to come back to that little bit extra in a minute, which is largely to do with carbon pricing. But at this stage, all I want to emphasize is that ownership with an attitude, a problem-solving mentality, a desire to cooperate with those who you have a commercial relationship with, produces material results fast. And it's not that hard to do. It's not easy, it's not a pushover, it requires effort, but when you've done it, you want to know, why isn't this done by more people? Why is this being given to me as a barrier? the owner-occupier barrier over and over again. No, it's not my interest to do that for my occupier. Not our experience. But then there's the question of investors. I got myself in a bit of trouble a week or two ago, allowing myself somehow to be quoted in the Times in an article that I had in some way promoted to the writer, that I'd never met a long-term investor. Which is a bit rude, given I've got some investors who at least think of themselves as long-term investors. What I was trying to say, and you know what it's like when you get quoted, it doesn't quite come out how you meant it, is that for the most part, institutional investors, no matter what they say about being long-term investors, are incentivized to deliver short-term results, and whose instincts are always to realize value as soon as possible, because they want that validation. Even in the property markets of their various types. When property could, and in my view should, be at the very least a medium-term investment. So here we have a real dilemma. Not only have we got a political cycle that spins fast, we've got a media cycle that's on all the time, we've got an investment cycle that's spinning fast. None of these systems fit with solving a complex, interrelated problem over a long term. If you want to deploy capital to deal with climate change and resource efficiency, you have to think long term and match it with actions. We do not have the right incentives for that in our investment system. I've been, for many years, chairman of the Carbon Disclosure Project. There'll be people in the room who are familiar with it or involved with it. Big enterprise now, over $55 trillion worth of money under management demanding information about climate change and carbon disclosure. But most of those investors have got the information now, but haven't changed their asset allocation, haven't really thought how they do long-term investment, even in an area like property. I gave a speech, some of you, a couple of you, Rob I know was there in Copenhagen, to an audience that was really very skeptical about the possibility, mostly a pension fund audience, Rob, who were very skeptical about, well, if there's anything they could do. But actually the one area where we just about hung on to them during the course of the day was property, because they could imagine deploying large amounts of capital in an asset class that they did understand and measure the performance over time and hold assets. It may be not what they would want to do for the bulk of their property investments, but they could imagine it. We don't have enough investment vehicles or property management companies that can hold on to the performance of a building for the long term. We still want to flip properties too quickly. And that makes it harder to hold these relationships together. Anyway, we might want to come back to that. There might be one or two people who want to contest that, but I don't think we have got close to building the right investment timeframes for dealing with this problem, nor the right corporate structures for deployment of capital into resolving these problems. And that's one of the reasons why I've spent time, and I know Peter has in this country, on the Green Investment Bank as an idea, as an institutional response to try and have long-term thinking attached to deployment of capital at scale in the public interest, but by pulling in private capital. And energy efficiency in urban areas is one of the themes that we chose in the UK, and you're going to see sometime this afternoon in the Chancellor's budget announcement further commitment to establishing the Green Investment Bank in the UK, although almost certainly they'll start with offshore wind and big renewables projects, which is a pity because I'd like them to do offshore wind, yes, absolutely, but do energy efficiency and the smart grid, please, at the same time. Okay, so we've got some background on climate change, we've got some background on resource efficiency. You've heard my observations about ownership with attitude and my concerns about long-term investing. But let me finish up and leave time for questions. I'm going to get that little document that I left on it, that little thing there underneath there. Yeah? Yeah. I'm really very proud of this work that my colleagues have done to assess the performance, the environmental performance of the investments that we've made in the first fund that we managed to raise and deploy, Green Buildings Fund. First of all, I've just got to be straight with you. It's a modest amount of money. It is not a huge fund. It was a brilliant achievement to raise it in the midst of the financial crisis, and many others tried and failed, so I'm pleased that we were able to get the money and deploy it. And now we've done some work, and Niels and others in the world have been involved with figuring out how this can be written on a larger scale. But let me tell you what my colleagues and their advisors, because we've managed to pull in some tremendous advisors, have done without, I have to say, without doing anything wildly revolutionary. There aren't big technological shifts taking place here, but in commercial property, in the UK, screened through a couple of very obvious tests of our own making about where a property is it subject to flood risk, you're taking big macro climate change risks into account, is it near public transport, and working through buildings that have got pretty poor ratings against standards that you're all very familiar with, without being wedded to any particular standard, because we think, particularly for retrofitting, not a lot of use in some of the international standards like BREEAM and LEED. All right for new developments, but not fantastic for retrofitting, and the bulk of the stock is what we're going to still have in 50 years. So I'm going to give you just a snapshot of this, and then I'm going to open up for questions. We have done a benchmarking process. We've looked at our buildings, we've tried to compare it to others, and there's a lot more detail in this report, and Tim's in here somewhere, he can talk to you about it afterwards. In 2 years, 2008, 2010, across our portfolio, we've managed total carbon reductions of 33%. In one building in Birmingham, I have to tell you a little anecdote here, very briefly, but it tells you the sort of human element to all of this. We bought a building, a prime property in Birmingham, lovely property. Probably wouldn't have got it if it hadn't been for being a distressed asset being sold, and we managed to nip in there. That building had an energy management system that was wrongly calibrated. We found out with our energy advisor within minutes this system was wrongly calibrated, completely, right? Sending out absolutely wrong information. We also found out that the retail outfit downstairs had been siphoning off power for years that the government occupier had been paying for. As soon as we found that out, we managed to negotiate a rebate from the utility to the government of £400,000. They were quite pleased about that. You can imagine a sort of cash-strapped executive of local government, a bit like this, finding an extra £400,000 on their P&L. Very nice, thank you very much. But in that building, we managed to achieve, because of these ridiculous errors, which are widespread. I bet there's some people in the room who know how often you find something similar. So I don't feel embarrassed about something so obvious being the reason why we achieved a 59% reduction in electricity usage. 59% in a relatively modern building, or a relatively recently upgraded building. 53% carbon reduction in that building in Birmingham. A good property. In Edinburgh, we bought a building as a commercial headquarters of a financial services business. Good building, well designed, good location, 12% electricity reduction, 7% carbon reduction. 31% electricity reduction across the portfolio, 25% less water consumption. That's interesting writ large. Just think what you could do in some parts of the world where water is a more expensive or scarce resource. That fund has done something clear at a relatively small scale that we can all learn from. There is nothing outrageously difficult or different being done to achieve those reductions. Can you imagine if you scaled it up across a city, across a portfolio held by a pension fund, across a portfolio held by an insurance business? Now, what would be nice is if you went back into those places and ask the folks who work there, did life get worse? Did you suffer any? Any deprivations? Did going to work feel a bit more problematic in the morning because these things were achieved? Any economic output lost to the economy? Any commercial relationship damaged? Why is this so hard? Why couldn't this be done by everybody? We're not that clever, quite clever, but not that clever. So I'm going to conclude there. I'm going to suggest to you that for all the attention properly paid to more urgent needs right in our faces today, the climate change problem is going to be with us, whether we like it or not, for the rest of our days, and we're just going to have to learn to manage it well. That with another parallel severe problem of resource efficiency, we actually have an opportunity to make huge investments in better converting primary energy into usable energy. Big investment opportunity with buildings in the center. That we have a lot to offer just by thinking differently about the ownership of property and the responsibility that comes, not some hair-shirted, worthy responsibility, just what happens if you own something and care about it and pay attention to its life. Buildings live and breathe. That our investment system is not yet tuned to long-term investment, whatever we say. Funny enough, those who are doing long-term investment and offering a real challenge to us are often sovereign wealth funds in Asian economies or family businesses or family corporations in Asia or here in Europe sometimes. The family enterprises, the intergenerational investments, they're long-term, but the bulk of our capital markets are not. They spin too fast, they don't lift their heads up, which might mean we need to intervene with specifically designed institutions like the Green Investment Bank. And then in our own experience, in one small fund in one part of the world, I think we offer an example, and I cannot for the life of me think why more people don't do it.